Welcome to Sunday Sermons from the Williamsburg Community Chapel, brought to you by the Chapel Podcast Network. Let's grab our Bibles and open up to the book of 2 Kings, chapter 25, and I'll read verses 24 through 26 for us now, as we prepare to hear from lead pastor Travis Simone as he helps introduce our new annual focus titled Exile. And Gedaliah swore to them and their men, saying, "Do not be afraid because of the Chaldean officials. Live in the land and serve the king of Babylon, and it shall be well with you." But in the 7th month, Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, son of Elishama, of the royal family, came with 10 men and struck down Gedaliah and put him to death along with the Jews and the Chaldeans who were with him in Mizpah. Then all the people, both small and great, and the captains of the forces arose and went to Egypt, for they were afraid of the Chaldeans.
Last week, I told you the story of exile. The year was 598 BC, and the international superpower Babylon attacked Jerusalem. Rather than risk an all-out war, the Bible says King Jehoiachin of Judah gave himself up to the king of Babylon. It's an important phrase. We'll come back to it later. I summarize the events like this. The military is defeated. The economy is decimated. Religious worship is desecrated. The government is dissolved, and the people are deported. We imagine some questions that people might have at this painful moment in the history of God's people. We ask the question, what did they feel? Why did it happen? We imagine that they likely asked themselves, how do we get home? But we don't have to only imagine what questions they might have asked. The Bible tells us the exact question that they did ask. It's in Psalm 137. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our lyres, for there our captors required of us songs. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. And here's the question. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? What they felt was sadness. There they are, weeping along the river Euphrates in Babylon. They had no idea how they were going to get home. Their captors there tormented them, the psalm says. They were in captivity. They said, why don't you sing us one of the good old songs of Zion? How about that? They hung their instruments up in the trees, for they did not know how to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land. The question they asked was, what do we do now? Is worship here even possible? Maybe you could summarize it with this question. How do we respond? And 2 Kings 25 answers this question. How did they respond to the exile? How did they respond? How did they attempt to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? The first response, the first instinct they had was to fight against Babylon. Fight against Babylon. Zedekiah makes this decision. It's actually the final verse of chapter 24. Just before chapter 25, you read these words, and Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. And then into our reading for the day, what happened? And in the 9th month, and then in the 9th year of his reign, in the 10th month, on the 10th day of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came with his army against Jerusalem and laid siege to it. And they built siege works all around it. The Babylonians, they've surrounded the city. That's what it means when it says they built siege works all around the city. The city is surrounded. No one's allowed in. No one's allowed out. That means no food is allowed in as well. Famine strikes the land. The people are increasingly desperate. The prophets report that some even reported tragically to cannibalism at this moment. There's a famine in the land, and eventually Babylon breaches the walls. Babylon finds a way in, and as Babylon breaches the walls, the king finds an escape hatch. Zedekiah, the very one who rebelled against Babylon, he breaks through the walls as well. He flees. He's overtaken in the plains of Jericho. File that detail away again for later. And this is what happens as he's overtaken in Jericho. Verses 6 and 7. Again, we tried to print as much of the reading as we could on the back of the bulletin. Verses 6 and 7, they captured the king. They brought him up to the king of Babylon at Riblah, and they passed sentence on him. They slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes and put out the eyes of Zedekiah, bound him in chains, and took him to Babylon. You see what happened here? Zedekiah is the last of the heirs of David to sit on the throne of Jerusalem. His sons represent the hope that God's promise in 2 Samuel to King David would continue on in the future. That David would have a house, a lineage, a dynasty forever, that God would make a covenant with David for him, his family, to sit on the throne in Jerusalem. And Zedekiah's sons are systematically murdered before his eyes. It's like the candle of God's covenant promises to David being snuffed out one by one by one. And then Zedekiah's eyes are gouged out. Do you understand the connection there? The man's eyes are gouged out so that the last thing he sees are the death of his sons. The last thing that he sees is God's covenant promise, the light of God's covenant promise going out. The fight against Babylon results in the death of the king's sons, blindness, captivity, and exile for the king. And that's not even the only consequence of fighting against Babylon. As the siege continues, the king of Babylon's chief henchman, a man named Nebuzaradan, that's a mouthful, Nebuzaradan, he sets fire to the temple. It's in verse 9. And he burned the house of the Lord and the king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every great house he burned down. Take note that the writer here starts the sentence with Nebuzaradan burning the temple, and he ends the sentence with the burning of the temple and these houses. The repetition of the word burned is the idea that these facts were almost too hard to comprehend. It's too much to imagine. They had to be repeated twice just to sink in. Davidic heirs to the throne and those representing the promises of God's covenant faithfulness to his people have been murdered. Zedekiah has been brutalized and carried into exile. The temple is burned, broken down, and pieces of it are carried off into exile. One biblical commentator writes of this scene, the impact of the whole is to exhibit the destruction as total, brutal, and irreversible. The fight against Babylon only leads to more chaos and a greater sense of loss. The second response that God's people have is to float along with Babylon. Float with Babylon. This is the story of Gedaliah. It starts in verse 22 of our passage. After Zedekiah is deported to Babylon, the king installs a governor that he knows will be loyal to the cause of Babylon, who will keep the people remaining in the land calm and submissive, and most importantly, paying their due taxes back to Babylon. The man's name is Gedaliah. And he admonishes the people in verse 24, it's gonna be okay as long as we cooperate, as long as we don't say too much, as long as we don't criticize, let's just float along with Babylon. Verse 24, and Gedaliah swore to them and their men saying, do not be afraid because of the Chaldean officials. And remember, as we go through this series, Chaldea is just another word for Babylon. Don't be afraid because of the Chaldean officials. Live in the land. Serve the king of Babylon, and it shall be well with you. But the one who floats with Babylon floats to his own destruction. A man named Ishmael comes with 10 men and kills Gedaliah. We don't want to float with Babylon. We'll keep fighting against Babylon. Thank you very much. Which leads to the final response to the exile, which is to flee from Babylon. This is in verse 26. Then all the people, both great and small, and the captains of the forces, that's the army that's left, the captains of the forces arose and went to Egypt, for they were afraid of the Chaldeans. Their fear of Babylon leads them to flee from Babylon. But this verse is much more than just the story of fear and flight. The story of exile in 2 Kings 24, 2 Kings 25, right at the end, the story of the exile ends with God's greatest act of salvation overturned. God's greatest act of salvation is the exodus from where? From Egypt. And at the end of this story, where do they go? They flee back to Egypt. Hundreds and hundreds of years of God's work with his people, his salvation to bring them out of Egypt in an instant, overturned. It's hard to overstate the importance of verse 26, that God actually introduces himself as the God who brought his people out of Egypt all over the Old Testament, particularly in the introduction to the 10 Commandments. Exodus chapter 20, verse 3, right before God gives them any commandment on how they should behave, he tells them about how they are saved, how they've been saved from Egypt. I am the Lord, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Now that you know that, you shall have no other gods before me. Psalm 77 speaks of this mighty act of God's salvation. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. The Exodus, God's greatest act of salvation, reversed. And remember where Zedekiah and his sons were caught. They were caught on the plains of Jericho, where God's people had their first victory as they entered the promised land. In the flight from Babylon to Egypt, the final flicker of hope is extinguished as salvation history is both reversed and erased. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? They responded to the exile by fighting against Babylon, floating with Babylon, or fleeing from Babylon. Now, last week, I did not simply tell the story of exile. I made the claim that the story of exile is the story of all our lives. The first humans sought to exercise their God-given dominion in creation on their terms rather than according to God's wisdom. And the result was exile. God sent humanity out from the garden. The American novelist John Steinbeck famously sums up the human condition with the phrase, east of Eden. We all live east of Eden. A cosmic sense of homelessness pervades all our lives. Pay careful attention to where the king exits the city. It's in verse 4 of our passage. Where does the king exit the city? Then a breach was made in the wall, and all the men of war fled by night by the way of the gate between the two walls by the king's garden. This word is used only a handful of times throughout the Old Testament, and it's always used with powerful connection back to the Garden of Eden, the true home that God created for humanity. The king doesn't simply flee the city. The king is pictured leaving the garden. You see, 2 Kings 25 is not simply the story of ancient exiles responding to a painful encounter with Babylon. 2 Kings 25 illuminates the natural responses of every person facing the alienation of life lived east of Eden. It reveals our primary responses, the primary responses of anyone who's ever faced depression, anyone who's ever lived with a strained relationship. It reveals the response of every kid who's ever felt left out, every victim of abuse, every parent of a wayward child, every person bound by addiction. It demonstrates the responses of every husband or wife who's experienced the betrayal of adultery, or of anyone who's worked for political change, only to see more of the same. It shows the responses of every believer living in a culture dominated by Babylon. How did they respond is an interesting exercise in biblical studies. The better question is, how do you respond? How do you respond to the places of exile in your own life? Do you fight? Do you just wail and scream and push and try harder and harder till you're just exhausted? Do you float? You go, well, I don't have any control over this anyway, so I guess I'm just going to sit back and not really do anything, and it's all in God's hands, I guess, so I'll just float along with it. Do you flee? Do you refuse to talk to that person ever again? Do you flee through use of substances like alcohol or medication, just numbing the pain and running away. For the residents of Jerusalem, each of these responses led to more damage and more destruction. And I would say that believers' response in our world today, the natural response to fight, to float, to flee, is doing increasing damage in our own culture. And so maybe another question: does 2 Kings 25 offer another option? Last week, we said the Bible explains rather than explains away our sense of exile. So can the Bible also help us respond to our exile? Nina's best friend growing up recently had triplets. And I might have a picture of the cute triplets. There they are. And I'll never forget the moment that Nina's friend told us that she was pregnant with triplets. We were all on the beach together, and what we all knew as she was sharing this news with us was that her husband had just recently been diagnosed with a rare form of blood cancer. And so they were trying to figure out how to treat the blood cancer. Was he even gonna make it through the treatments? He's in the Navy, had just, because of the cancer, had to be removed from the job that he loved and placed on some more administrative duties. They were going through so much. And she says, I need to tell all my friends something. John and I were pregnant with triplets. And I don't know. I don't know if John's gonna make it. I don't know if all three kids are gonna make it. I don't know if my body can handle it. I don't know if we're gonna be able to even afford it. I don't know. So many unknowns. And most of us sitting there were kind of they also have two other children. I failed to mention that. Two other children, quite young. The triplets would mean 5 kids under 5. And so most of us sitting there listening to the story, we were in the throes of our own parenting journey and the own difficulties of our parenting journey. But there was another person sitting in that circle on the beach, and it was Nina's mom. And Nina's mom is legendary in the city of Virginia Beach for her care for children. She'll take care of anyone's kids. Volunteered in children's ministry for over 30 years. Still leads, in her late 60s, leads Young Life and runs a vacation Bible school on the beach for kids that live in government housing near the ocean front. And Nina's mom stands up and grabs Erin and looks her right in the eye and says, "You are the chosen one. You are the chosen one." She was shaking her. "You are the chosen one." I've told this story 3 times this week. I cry every time. "You are the chosen one," she says to her. See, Nina's mom saw what we couldn't see. She saw God's hand guiding, perhaps even sending Erin into an even deeper state of exile. 5 kids under 5 to go along with a husband with cancer. And I know some of you are driven into your deeper state of exile because you haven't been able to have kids, or you've lost kids. But perhaps God has chosen you for this assignment. I believe the author of 2 Kings sees this clearly too. It's in verse 20 of our passage from last week. 2 Kings 24:20. For because of the anger of the Lord, it came to the point in Jerusalem and Judah that he cast them out from his presence. And when we read that in English, you think immediately this is just a negative thing. They were cast out from God's presence. What a terrible thing. And that might be what you feel in the state of your exile. What a terrible thing. But in Hebrew, the word there for cast out is shalach. And it means to send out. Like God sent out the prophets. It's not an inherently negative word. And so the exile is both punishment for sin and selfishness, and it's God's opportunity to be sent into the world. And that, I believe, is the message of 2 Kings 25. You've been sent. You've been sent. In the midst of the pain, in the midst of the hardship, in the midst of the destruction, in the midst of brokenness, in the midst of the smoldering temple, God's people were sent. In the midst of cultural confusion that we face in our day, you've been sent. It's a dramatic paradox that Rich kind of asked me, was I okay this morning? I said, I'm kind of just trembling before this idea that the temple is burning and God is sending. You see, the only person who ends up alive at the end of the story of exile is Jehoiachin. At the end of chapter 25, after everyone has fled to Egypt, Jehoiachin, Zedekiah's nephew, he is alive in Babylon, and the king of Babylon releases him from captivity, and he puts on a royal robe, and he dines with the king, and you just kind of see this guy just there in Babylon. He's the only one alive at the end of the story, and he's the only one who willingly went to Babylon. It was in our passage last week, 2 Kings 24:12. And Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, gave himself up to the king of Babylon. In Hebrew, the phrase is literally, he went out to the king of Babylon. Just like Noah went out of the ark, Jehoiachin went out to Babylon. Jehoiachin was sent. And you've been sent. Now ask yourself the question, how do I respond now? How does knowing that you've been sent, you are the chosen one for this particular assignment of exile, how does that actually change your response to your exile? Don't fight. Don't float. Don't flee. Live faithfully within Babylon. That's the assignment. That's what you see Jehoiachin doing at the end of the passage. That's what we'll hear Jeremiah say a little later in another series in our annual focus on exile. Live faithfully. He's just present there faithfully at the king's table. What would it look like to live faithfully within the places of exile in your life? This would be a fantastic question to ask in your small groups. What would it look like to live faithfully within the places of exile in your life? And I don't have time to unpack this all right now. I just want to paint some broad strokes to help us understand a biblical response to exile. But one of the things is it looks like waiting. That's what Jehoiachin is doing. It looks like perseverance. It looks like forgiveness. It looks like reconciliation when there's repentance. It looks like prayer. It looks like not contributing to the mentality that everyone wants to have, which is just fight against Babylon, but to be a faithful presence there within it. Along with all of you, had the privilege of knowing for almost a decade of time our pastor of care emeritus, Claude Marshall, who's been doing his own battle. He's been on his own battle with cancer. And I recently went to visit him. As we announced, he's entered hospice care. And I wanted to see him before he passed away and talk to him. He gave pastoral care to so many people. I thought every pastor needs a pastor, and I'll go down to Durham and provide some pastoral care for Claude. I asked him for permission to share this story, and I said, I have that picture of us on your front porch, but I don't need to show it. I know you lost some weight. He said, show him the picture. Love for my chapel family to see me as I love seeing them when he worships with us online. And we sat there on his front porch, and I asked him, I said, Claude, do you have any fear? He looked at me, he said, no. I said, really? He said, no, I don't have any fear. I know Jesus has gone before me. I said, well, how can I pray for you? He said, pray that I would be faithful to each moment God gives me. Pray that I would be faithful to each moment that God gives me. He said, a dinner with my family, a medical appointment with my doctors. How can I be faithful in each moment that God gives me, in each place where God sends me? And I asked the question, where can someone get that kind of courage and strength to faithfully face what appears to be the final exile, which is death? When God, in and as Jesus Christ, entered the exile of the human condition, he did not fight against those who sought to put him to death. Pilate says to Jesus, don't you hear all the things that they testify against you? And Jesus gave them no answer, not even to a single charge, Matthew records. So that Pilate is amazed. He won't even fight when they're trying to put him to death. But Jesus didn't float along with a whatever happens kind of attitude. As the time approached for him to be taken unto heaven, Luke records that Jesus resolutely set his face toward Jerusalem. That's where I'm going. That's where I'm called. I'm the chosen one for that assignment of exile, and I will walk into it. He certainly didn't flee from even the worst moments of his exile. On the cross, do you know what they said to him? Come on down, save yourself. Come down from the cross. You saved others. You can save yourself. Angels attended him in the wilderness temptation. They could have attended him there if he had only asked, and yet he would not flee from the moment. He was faithful within the ultimate exile of death. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Those were his last words, words of trust and obedience. And what this means is that when we place our faith and trust in Jesus Christ, we are given a new life and empowered by his Spirit to live faithfully wherever and to whoever he sends us. So this morning, in whatever exile you face, you've been sent. God has chosen you for that assignment. Don't fight. Don't float. Don't flee. Live faithfully within Babylon.
Thank you for joining us today. Here at the Williamsburg Community Chapel, we are all about making disciples of Jesus Christ. So wherever you are on your spiritual journey, we hope you will join us this year as we study the biblical theme of exile and learn how to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land.